So good afternoon, everybody. I think it's time to start. We have a lot of information to cover in the session called Building a Private Cloud in 75 Minutes. Thank you for coming to my session. I know we had a hard keynote and the demo gods weren't all too forgiving there, but I hope mine will. And thank you for allowing me to be your first opening session, where we'll dive into how to build a private cloud using Windows Server, Hyper-V, and System Center. Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Maarten Goed. I'm a System Center MVP from the Netherlands. I work from a day-to-day basis on delivering clouds based on System Center and Hyper-V in Western Europe. And I'm taking that experience to explain you on the practical approach on building your own private cloud using the Microsoft technology. And talking about private cloud, it's inevitable in a sense that we've always used the traditional model of having physical servers, and in the past 10 years we've been virtualizing, I guess, more or less half to three-quarters of our data center. But you see that users and IT management wants the characteristics of a public cloud more or less internally as well, and wants to shift to this model where we can easily provide resources and easily maintain them, scale out, have self-service, and all these characteristics internally as well, as they see that they have that outside as well. Now, a private cloud, to me, is four things. It's pooling the resources we have already today, so it's not replacing anything, but taking the resources you have today, the physical hardware, the compute layer using your virtualization software, in our case Hyper-V, taking the network, the storage, and all these elements and pulling them together and providing an abstract layer on top of which we can deliver applications. Another item of private cloud to me is providing self-service. And self-service could be to another IT department where we allow them to request resources, whether it's a VM or a full service or just a capacity pool. It's allowing them to request that and having a process in place to fulfill, to do the service request management and fulfill that order. But it could also very well be that it's self-service to our end users, where we allow them to request some kind of computing resource from our data center. Another key aspect to private cloud to me is elasticity. We want to be able, of course, to provision these services that they request, but depending on resource usage, depending on all these factors, we need to also be able to scale down, and elasticity is also allowing us to scale down as needed when we don't need those resources anymore. And of course, usage-based, things like capacity management, knowing how much we use, based on usage, maybe scale up, but usage-based is also a very important piece in providing a private cloud. And we'll have a look on all these key items during the presentation, and we'll have a lot of demos, along with a lot of slides, because some of these things I've prepared to give you a holistic view of all the steps you need to undertake. In our case, in 75 minutes, maybe in the real world, a bit more on getting it in your company in place. Now, talking about the Microsoft private cloud, there are a few things that are important when looking at that. We have to care about identity, things like Active Directory. We care about virtualization. We need to have that in place and well managed. Of course, the management layer itself, I think System Center and all the management pieces in there and the processes we need to do to maintain our virtualization and cloud layers are important as well as that Microsoft has a common development stack from which we saw this morning in the keynote. We can develop things that we can move from on-premise to public cloud as well. But we won't look at public cloud in this session. We'll have a look at how Windows Server and Hyper-V complement each other to provide you a real-world private cloud. Now, looking at the practical approach of getting there, there are a few steps involved, to my opinion, to get there. It's a practical approach on delivering a private cloud using System Center, and it starts, I guess, with putting in place a System Center virtual machine installation that can help you start provision your Hyper-V hosts, connect to your storage, connect to network, which we'll look in phase 2. Phase 3 will be all about putting Operations Manager and monitoring in place, then looking at Service Manager on putting that in place to do the processes in, orchestrator for some of the runbooks and some of the provisioning of the resources we'll provide, data protection manager for backing up and restoring things. We'll look at the setup, integration parameters, and all these phases we need to walk through to get a private cloud. And we'll look at per phase what the steps are, how to get there, and at the end of a phase we'll look at a demo on how we did that, or what's the end result, or how specific the things we did. So have a look at phase 1, where we'll actually install and configure System Center Virtual Machine Manager. And it's a bit like the chicken and egg. Where do you start? We need to have Virtual Machine Manager in place, of course, to start provisioning our hosts. And this would be something that you would install first. Now, of course, I'm not going to run you through the typical installation. It's, I think, straightforward. You need a SQL installation, you need Active Directory and an OS, and you'll be able to install Virtual Machine Manager. But there's a new thing to Virtual Machine Manager in 2012 is that we can actually set it up high available. And that's important because cloud and all these management of our clouds become more important. We need to be able to highly available, create our System Center Virtual Machine Manager high available. And it's actually clustering technology we use. If you install high available Virtual Machine Manager on a cluster, it actually prompts you for high availability. And when you add a second node and do a second installation, it will actually configure the second installation for you, and you'll have an active-passive situation, and VMM will be high available. The next step would be to connect to your storage. And not every storage can be connected to from Virtual Machine Manager. You actually need to have support in your storage for SMIS. And we see vendors these days upgrading the firmwares, upgrading the software to start supporting SMIS. But it's relatively new, so it might be the case that you need to look into your storage vendor to see whether or not they're supporting SMIS. And when you're purchasing new hardware, of course, having SMIS would be a requirement, I guess. But even the lower end storage, like the other day I had a HP P2000 that I upgraded firmware from, actually gave us SMIS support. And you can connect to the IP address of the storage, and you'll get all the LUNs and all the available storage you can start managing from VMM. Of course, the next step will be to configure all the settings you need for network. Things like the MAC address pools that you'll be provisioning, connecting to load balancers that we can actually talk to. And that's important because in a later step, we'll be provisioning services, and a service will exist of multiple VMs and network definitions. And when we start managing these services, we might need to update, for instance, our load balancing configuration, and VMM can do that for you. Now, getting the basic VMM steps in place means that we need to start working with templates. And I guess from the previous version of VMM 2008 R2, you saw that we could have VM templates, and we could have a Windows Server VM or another type of VM template. But in 2012, we actually have new templates, and we'll actually have what we call a service template. And like we said, it's a definition of the application that we want to provision on our cloud or that we want to manage on our cloud. And I'll give you an overview in the demo in a second. One of the new things that 2012 also delivers on is patch management. And we've been doing traditionally, I guess, patch management a bit from WSUS itself or from Configuration Manager, no matter the version. But in VMM 2012, you actually see that we can manage the same WSUS server and use it for patching our clusters. Now, if you have a clustered environment, you have Hyper-V running in a cluster, it actually helps because it will move all your resources. It will evaluate whether or not it needs to patch and which patches are applied, do a reboot, and when it comes back up, it will move the resources back. And it really orchestrates all of the things you need to do to patch your cluster and all your nodes. So it's a helpful addition we have now in VMM 2012. And then the last step is actually adding the PXE server, because from this VMM installation, we want to provision our first Hyper-V host. And of course, we want to do that through network boot. So we can actually hook into a WDS server, an existing one or a new one on the VMM box, for instance. And we can set it up in a way that there's a boot image that VMM provides, and new servers that boot will actually see that boot image and then start applying the Hyper-V installation. Now let's have a look in our demo. There we go. So I'm running this on my laptop. It's actually Windows Server 2008 R2. I have Hyper-V role enabled, and you see a few VMs running, a domain controller, some of the System Center titles, and you see some 4 stock VMs as well, which we'll dive into next. Now I'm logged on to my Windows 7 VM that has all the System Center consoles on it. You, for instance, see Orchestrator, Virtual Machine Manager, Service Manager, Ops Manager, which I'll be managing from here. Now let's have a look at Virtual Machine Manager. I've got VMM in place. In my case, it's non-high available. I only have one laptop here. And you see that I've used my laptop as an Hyper-V host. It's responding. It has a certain CPU usage and memory. And when we look at things like overview, we can get a feel of the performance of our Hyper-V host today. Now, like we said, how did we add the resources? We actually now in the Fabric workspace have the opportunity to add resources, a Hyper-V host, a Citrix Xen server, and a VMware ESX server. That's actually new to 2012 that we can support Xen server, and that we have a multi-hypervisor strategy where we want VMM to be the single point of management for our whole environment, whether it's Hyper-V or another technology. Now, when doing Hyper-V, we could, of course, just add an existing machine that we already put in AD, but there's a new option called provisioning physical computers, and it will actually allow us to add a certain new computer as a Hyper-V host to our cloud. Now, if you look at all the workspaces, there are 5 that VMM has: the VMs and services space, Fabric, library, jobs, and settings. The Fabric is where we just talked about all the basic elements that we need to pull together to create our cloud in just a few minutes. But there's also the library workspace that stores, like we said, the things like the VM template, but also things like the content itself. If you look at the library server and the library folder, in my case, you see a stock trader folder, and it has all these items like the VHDs, but it has also items like what we call server application virtualization packages. And the one thing that we're introducing with Virtual Machine Manager 2012 is that we'll have server application virtualization, much like you have that on the desktop today with the Windows OS. Now, it is a bit of the same, that will encapsulate an application in what you could call a bubble, and that server application virtualization package will just run on a Windows Server OS, much like you see that on the desktop side of things. So we can package it up, and we can use it later on in our template to deploy to our clouds. I've gone ahead and I already created a few templates, and the one we'll look into is a stock trader service template. And again, a service template being the definition of the application that we want to maintain and deploy. Now, because of the resolution, I need to scroll a bit. But what you see here is that in my stock trader definition, I have 4 tiers. I have the database tier, which we have here, which has 5 databases associated. We have the web tier, 2 websites associated, and a middleware tier and another middleware tier that actually have the server application virtualization packages. Now, if I double click, and we actually have versioning of the templates, we can see how these tiers are built up. As it loads, there we go. Of course, we have the hardware configuration, which is much like the VM configuration we had in previous versions. So we can set processor, we can set dynamic memory, all these kinds of things. And again, it's not just for Hyper-V, it's for all the other virtualization vendors as well. Now, new is that we can actually provision the OS items, so product key, time zone, kind of operating system, but we can also install roles. So if you need the IIS web role, you can just click it here and it will actually be deployed once we deploy this tier. Now, if we look at the application configuration, you'll actually see the 5 databases where our service consists of. And those are what we call DACPAC images, DACPAC files. Those are SQL files that you can prepare that holds the definition of a certain database. And we can add other items as well. So if you want to add web items, virtual applications, SQL Server databases, or even scripts, you could do so from here. And with the introduction of SQL Server 2008 R2, you're actually able to sysprep, as we call, or make it image ready, an instance of SQL. And with Virtual Machine Manager 2012, you can actually make sure that this image-based SQL installation that's in your sysprepped VHD can be configured during runtime, during deployment with VMM. We'll give it a name, and we can do things like set configuration, set security. Now you'll prepare all these things, and this is actually a definition of the service we want to deploy. And this is the first thing we need to do before we take any other steps in our private cloud to deploy this stock trader service for our business. Now we'll come back to that in a second, but we'll first have a look at the other steps we need to perform. Okay, phase 2, provisioning the fabric. And in our case, we need to provision the Hyper-V hosts that we need to deploy this service on. Like we said, there's a new Add Hyper-V host wizard in VMM that we can use to either connect an existing Hyper-V installation and manage that one, or for new computers that came out of the box, provision them as Hyper-V hosts. If you look at the wizard, it actually connects through what we call an industry standard with the acronym of IPMI. And those are interfaces such as the Dell DRAC, HP ILO, all these out-of-band controllers we have in hardware where we connect to, and from there on can actually power on a host, take over screen, all these basic items we can do. So we'll connect through IPMI. Of course, we need to have an IP address of the machine that will be provisioning, so the IP address of the ILO adapter or the DRAC connector. Then we want to make sure that we either give it a fixed address during deployment or do DHCP, select which host group that will allow it to join. And actually, that's pretty much it. During one of the screens, we had to input our credentials as well, but based on that, we'll connect to ILO. It will power on, for instance, the server if it's still powered off. It will do a network boot, and from that network boot, it will actually detect our VMM boot image, which is Windows PE, and from Windows PE, it will actually connect back to the VMM because the VMM agent is inside the PE image. Now, from there on, it will actually start deploying the VHD, and you might say VHD, question mark. Well, the reason is we do a VHD boot. So the OS is not deployed on disk directly. We'll do a VHD applying of the OS, and then we'll set the boot order so it does a VHD boot. From there on, of course, it will do the standard OS installation, so it will apply all the system settings, make it ready for managing, and from there on, the password can be set, and we can connect to the, for instance, Active Directory domain Hyper-V host. Now, the one thing you might run into, and the question that you might have based on this information is, but what about unknown hardware? Because the PE image needs to know about certain controllers, like the disk controller, the network controller, to be able to, of course, copy the VHD, connect to the network, and your hardware might be so new that you won't have the drivers in the PE. Well, there's no problem. If it hangs or for some reason doesn't complete the procedure, you can actually remote into the server and do Shift F10, and you have a DOS box and see whether or not certain hardware is there, see how the network is doing, but assess the situation. When you found out that a certain driver is missing, you can actually use the driver injection script on the VMM server to inject the driver that you found on, for instance, the manufacturer's website into the Windows PE image. And from there on, we'll have the correct drivers. There's one last step, is that we need to update that WinPE image that is now injected on disk into VMM, apply the new image, and next time it'll boot, it'll have the driver, so you can actually do the whole process. And by that time, we'll have our first Hyper-V host that we can join into a host group. And that actually allows us to start working with that host. Again, in my situation, for demo purposes, the Hyper-V host is already joined. And if I go to clouds and services, or VMs and services, you'll actually see in the Wunderbar that we have the option of creating a cloud, and that we can look at two ways at our host groups and our clouds. We can look at the individual VMs, and we can have a look at the services. Now, I've already created a cloud, but for demo purposes, I'll show you the screens. We'll call it TAGAT North America Production Cloud. Next. Again, here we need to select which of the resources we want to pull into this cloud and start creating available for our end users. We'll use the all hosts group, which is the only Hyper-V host I have, but I could also select the VMware resource pool. We'll connect the logical networks for this cloud, production, any load balancers we might have, any virtual IP addresses we might have. And here you see, because of the connection I have to my, in my demo situation, a NetApp emulator, I've created two LUNs to show you the difference between, for instance, gold storage and silver storage. And we'll select the gold storage, which has a 6 GB total capacity. Any library paths you want to join, and I guess this is the most important piece, is where we can set the limits of this cloud and set the limits of the total capacity that we will be providing on this cloud. We could do it from the number of virtual CPUs, on memory, on storage. We could have custom quota points, for instance, that we'll be using in the portal. VMA is so many points, VMB has so many points. And of course, the number of virtual machines could be limited. We'll leave it to maximums, select Hyper-V as the hypervisor, and we'll click Finish, and we'll actually have our cloud. Now, what we saw with the library and the service template, if I open it up again, we saw the definition of our service. I'll zoom in a bit. And we actually saw that if we click the web node, that here under, it's actually a node that can be scaled out. So the default instance count is 1, but the maximum we could have is 5. And we'll have a look at that in a few minutes. Now we could say configure deployment, and it will actually ask us where do you want to deploy this total service. We'll call it production V1. And here you can see that we can select either host groups or individual hosts, or select a certain cloud where we'll deploy it to. I'll hit OK, and we'll get into the validation screen where it actually will select the Hyper-V host that is best fit for receiving the service. In our case, it will start enumerating our VM names, and we actually, during deployment time, can specify certain things like password or other things that I want to use encrypted during my deployment sequence. Now, I've gone ahead and deployed this already. And this was the reason that in our Hyper-V manager screen, you saw the VOR VMs with the sequence name. I have a stock BSL, stock MID, stock SQL, stock web VM. But that's the VM view. If I look at the services view, you actually see that VMM has an understanding of where the VMs fit in our service. And if I expand this a bit, you'll actually see that StuckTrader is running, and I'll do it a bit more so, on our private cloud. The SQL tier has this VM, and it has all these databases associated with the service as total. So the service was actually deployed to our cloud. Now from here on, you actually see that we manage it as a total service instead of a few individual VMs. Because if I right-click the service, and I'll do it a bit like this, we can actually start the service. And it actually will see which is the node I need to start first and second, and then start the service. And I'll go ahead and start that. And we'll actually see them start on Hyper-V Manager, so that's OK. But we saw the other item as well, is that we can set scale out. And this is what we can do manually, but also later on when we got Ops Manager deployed, we can do it automatically if you wish. Scale out means that, like we just saw with the web server tier, where we can have a maximum of 5, we want to provision another node and make a scale out of the service and, for instance, handle the extra load that we have during peak moments, end of year, end of month situations. We'll hit scale out. And it asks us, because it knows of all these tiers, which tier do you want to scale out? We'll say web tier. We won't give it the machine name because it will just enumerate from the template we have. It'll start creating stock web 002, like you can see. Hit next, and basically when I hit scale out, it will now start provisioning another VM with the same settings, same OS, same packages on there. And based on the template, if we have a connection to our load balancer, it might also update our load balancer so that traffic is really redirected to the second node as well. Okay. Bless you. From phase 3, the next thing we could do, and there's not a particular order, but I've done it from experience, is one of the first things I do, is I install and configure Operations Manager. And Operations Manager, of course, looking at monitoring, looking at managing this environment. Again, here, I won't run you through all the steps that you need to do to actually install Operations Manager. It's fairly straightforward. The only thing that really matters is the accounts and the initial database size and making sure that you have a proper configuration for your Operations Manager. But once we get that in place, the first thing we need to do is deploy agents. And deploy agents, of course, on the Hyper-V host that will manage. If it's another Hyper-V hypervisor will manage, we might need a management pack or something else, but we'll focus on Hyper-V, so we'll be deploying agents on our Hyper-V hosts. Now, if they're in the domain, it's not a problem. We can just use Kerberos, the standard wizard that will just deploy. If they're DMZ hosts or the non-domain joint, you might get into an advanced situation where you need a certificate or a gateway server to connect them. But in the end, we need to get the agent deployed so we can pick up on the information on our Hyper-V hosts. Now, next up is deploying management packs. And of course, we need management packs for monitoring the base OS, maybe some of the hardware items. But the one thing that's important from an integration standpoint, and for later on in this demo showing you how to build on that private cloud, is that we need to import the Virtual Machine Manager 2012 management packs. Those are actually the basis for which we'll start synchronizing off in the next few minutes. So make sure that you import the management packs that you get from the VMM installation media. Then from the VMM console, from the VMM side of things, we need to configure that integration between VMM and Operations Manager. Now that actually involves installing the Operations Manager console on the VMM server. And that's because we need all the DLLs to do the connection. But from there on, you can use the wizard in VMM to configure Operations Manager. And like you see here on the screenshot, we can specify the server name. There's an item where we can specify username and password, and it'll connect, and it will actually start flowing the data. Now, there are a few check marks that you can set, like you see here. Enabling Pro, and Pro was something we introduced with VMM 2008, is where management packs can detect certain situations, like, hey, my UPS might have a failing battery, or other circumstances that you might want to take into account. For instance, to move VMs off a host because it's connected to that UPS. And Pro will make sure that information from OM will flow back to VMM so it can take a decision. Now, on the basic elements, like how's memory doing, how's CPU doing, that's something we today call dynamic optimization in VMM. And with dynamic optimization, we can actually, within VMM, already take into account that a certain host is overloaded and start moving off VMs. And we don't need Pro today for that. Pro is just for the more advanced scenarios. And then you see the enable maintenance mode integration, which is helpful if you'll start doing maintenance. We can have one console in one place. And from there on, we should be OK. Now, there's another tab you see on SQL analysis services. If you have SQL analysis services, either on your VMM host or on your Ops Manager installation, it will allow VMM to push some info into that so you can do some capacity and other items there. And I'll show that in a few minutes. From there on, one best practice would be to test the integration. There's a commandlet on the VMM side of PowerShell that's called write SC Ops Manager connection. It will actually show you if the connection is there, if it's able to write information to Ops Manager and get information back. And it's a helpful commandlet to have to see if the integration is working. Now, what do we get if we configure all that? And I'll actually minimize the VMM console and step up to the Ops Manager console. Now this is Ops Manager 2012, and on first sight you might not notice a real lot of differences between 2007 and 2012, but there sure are, and I'll show you in the next seconds. If we scroll down, you could typically say that all these folders relate to what we call a management pack on the Ops Manager side. So you see that I already imported quite some management packs from SharePoint on. But the Virtual Machine Manager folder actually corresponds with the VMM management pack. And you can see that we have a few folders that relate to certain elements in our cloud. Now if I go look and I click on the host health, for instance, you'll actually see that information from VMM was populated into Ops Manager. For instance, here we see my laptop name, all the characteristics. We see 2 alerts actually associated with my laptop, high CPU utilization and high memory utilization. And if we click the diagram view, we actually get a graphical overview of our live Hyper-V host. And we'll expand the view and you see things like my DC VM, the other System Center VMs, and so forth. Now if we look at things like storage pool, you actually see that the 2 LUNs that we had in VMM, aggregate 0 and aggregate 1 from my NetApp emulator, were actually pushed through from VMM to OM. And if we look at the diagram view, we'll actually see that storage elements get the characteristics like the total capacity, the capacity used. But from here on we can also do open performance view. And I'll select a few counters, already did. Used capacity versus total capacity, so it's almost at capacity. Those are the things we'll get as well. So that means that we not necessarily need to have a management pack for our storage, but once our storage is connected in VMM through SMIS, sorry, we'll actually see that information will flow to OM and we can do all the monitoring tasks. Of course, the virtual machine health. So we'll get the virtual machines that are provisioned on our host. We'll get them here. But more importantly, I guess, is the cloud health. And you actually see that it's real time because the cloud I just created is already here in monitoring. So the connection is almost near real time between VMM and OM. But if I expand my private cloud, you'll actually see that service called StockTrader. And I can expand that. You'll see the 4 tiers and you'll see the VMs under there. So it has an understanding of how we provision that service, and that'll be the basis for all the other management processes that we'll have around our private cloud. So we'll have an understanding of this distributed application. Now, one of the new things we have in OM 2012 is called network monitoring. And if I have a look at network devices, you'll actually see that I have an emulator running with 4 network devices, and the network devices are things like a Cisco PIX, a Cisco switch, and Cisco router that we can now natively add. And we can add them by hand. For each device we have an IP address and SNMP. We can, of course, add it. But we also introduced recursive discovery. And what recursive discovery does is we actually specify a seed device. And a seed device is a device in your network that we'll use to contact and from there on look into your network. And we'll look at its neighbors, at its peers to detect whether or not we have other, here we go, other devices and start mapping them and start monitoring them as well. So we can do explicit discovery or recursive discovery. Now if I go back to the network device list, and for instance I take the Cisco switch, again, here I can do a diagram view as well. And we'll actually see that one port is having problems. You can look at memory and other items like the other ports. Now you might ask us, why is this port not monitored? Because an empty green circle actually means it's not monitored. We actually detect from Ops Manager whether or not it has a cable plugged in or whether or not it's administratively down. And it doesn't make sense to monitor, I guess, ports that are not connected. Of course, from here on, you could forcefully enable it, but by default, if we plug something in or put it administrative up, it actually will start monitoring minutes after that. So that's the network piece that's actually new. Now, the one thing we wanted to do from here is that we wanted to monitor that stock trader service that we have running on our private cloud. And we saw the service being pushed from VMM, but those are more the basic semantics, like what is the VM, what are the basic elements. What we really want to do is create a distributed application. And a distributed application is more or less a visual representation of the application that's running on our cloud. So we could say stock trader app. We'll start with a blank and choose a management pack to save it in. And within this distributed application designer, within Ops Manager, we could actually drag and drop elements in that we consider to be elements of our service. So you could say there's a database involved. And where we go, application component, database, it's a SQL database. And on the left-hand side, we'll see all the SQL databases that we'll have, and we'll just select one of the stock trader DBs, stock trader DB. Add another component, say website, there's a website involved. Application component, website, okay. And we'll just do the stock web 001. And we could drag a relation saying, hey, this website actually uses, that didn't work. There we go. This website actually uses this database to communicate on. Now, I already prepared that ahead of time. How does that look? What does the end result give you? What we call a distributed application view. Here we go. It could actually give us a fairly simple, here we go, representation of the application. But in the real world, of course, your application might be more advanced, more elements to it. One of the things I wanted to show is that you could use Visio as well. If you take a basic architecture of your application, and again, this might be something that you already prepared ahead of time, you actually see that we could draw advanced overviews of the application that will be running on our clouds. And with Visio 2010 and the Operations Manager add-in, you can actually connect to Ops Manager. Now, what does it give you? I will take this Visio drawing and, for instance, take this database. I will actually say group, and from there on, link a shape. And what we'll be doing is linking this shape to a certain item within Ops Manager. We'll say database, stock, trader, DB. We'll say link. And what you see happening is, you can just barely see it, it gets a green check mark. And then if you look at the lower pane, it actually connects to a certain unique ID within Ops Manager. Now this helps. You can do this for all these elements, and of course you can already push F5 from within Visio, and you'll have this full screen view of monitoring where states will actually flip back and forth based on any problems that occur. But you might want to have it accessed by co-workers or by management or end users. So one of the new things you get in SharePoint or in Visio 2010 is the ability to save to SharePoint. So from here on, we can save it as a web drawing. And if we go to SharePoint, and I've just created a default site which I've called the IT Management Portal, you can actually add that file. Say, we'll go to all site content, go to dashboards. I just put these files in place and enable the Visio web service in SharePoint. Now if I go open this up in Visio, you'll actually see this same drawing, and you'll see some states, and I can also do refreshing. Now it renders in Silverlight, so a lot of browsers are supported, but you could also render it in image files, and even more browsers would be supported. And because of the refresh, it will just flip back and forth based on state changes. And of course, from here on, you could also do things like drill down. I could create, let's say, a network dashboard, and from there, I might say I want to have a look at my switches, have a look at certain countries, for instance, the Netherlands, my home country, and for instance, a certain city. I will show certain devices or certain components. But you could also do a drill down from a business service saying, I'll create a Visio that actually shows me the orders for my application, shows me whether or not the components are working, drill down to the application layer, any imports, exports, or other things, and all the way down to infrastructure, where we'll see our Hyper-V host, see our switches, see our SAN connection, and all based on Visio, the Ops Manager add-in, and if you want to make it live, pull it into SharePoint 2010 so you can share it. Now, talking about capacity management, and let's close this one. There are a few ways to approach capacity management, because there are 5 things we need to do from a monitoring perspective. We have to look at availability, performance, security, configuration, and capacity. Now, the first 4 are actually delivered by OM out of the box, in a sense that you can have monitors in a management pack that correspond to any of these state changes. But capacity is a bit more advanced. We want to take this performance info and do things like trending, forecasting, and get a feel of where capacity is going. Now, you could do that in Excel, and we saw that this morning in the keynote as well, is that there's an add-in called Power Pivot. And Power Pivot actually allows us to navigate through, well, loads of data, big data, if you will. So in our case, we'll connect to Ops Manager, and we'll say the VM is called Ops Manager. The database is actually the Ops Manager data warehouse database, which stores information for a year or longer, depending on your settings. And we can specify the tables and the information we want to use, but I've gone and created a query for us, so we don't need to select the tables on stage. But there are actually only 4 tables involved in getting the data, and I'll publish to my blog this query as well. So almost 200,000 records. And from here, I'll create a chart in Excel with this data. And what I want to do is I want to chart the value. On the x-axis, I'll have the date time. We use the display name as a slicer. How about object name as a slicer, counter name as a slicer, and for instance, date time to do some selections. And I'll actually filter this a bit based on the resolution, drag it a bit to the right. So I want to change the chart to, let's say, a line chart, so it's more readable. And I want to filter down to my Hyper-V host, which was called laptop. And of course, we could also filter the query, but I'll select laptop. I want to do the Hyper-V logical processor total runtime, and you'll see from February until now a certain performance from my processor on my laptop. But using the slicer, of course, I could say I'll limit it to first 6 days of March, and you'll see a certain performance. Now, one of the things you could do is say I'll add a trend line in Excel, and we'll say more. We'll say we want to go forward 50 periods, and periods correspond to the number of data we have, the time cycles for our data. And we'll say something like a red glow so we can see it. So based on the first 6 days in March and trending that 50 periods to the future, we'll see we'll actually start climbing. Now, if we remove the filter, we actually see that in the 4 months I've been using this laptop and doing demos, I've been starting to use more CPU time on average, but it's still not up until 80 or 100, so that we need to think of buying a new computer. So we can carry on as we did. But using these slices and dices, of course, we can gain some insight into capacity for this or other items. And again, here, same deal. We can save it to SharePoint so my coworker can use it as well and slice and dice through this data. Now, you might say, this is all a bit much to me. I need to find out the query. I need to use these trend lines. I just want to have it prefab. Now, there are management pack vendors that actually supply these management packs for Ops Manager as well. And one of them being OpsLogix. And what they do is they take the VMM data on CPU, on memory, on all these items, start looking at data. And then if I took, for instance, CPU, you'll actually see trend lines, and we can shift between periods. And like we sit in the home screen, we can still see how much VMs we can provision based on certain characteristics that we can change. So there are prefab solutions as well. Now, that was phase 3. monitoring the fabric. From there on, we need to put in place Service Manager, because Service Manager, for one thing, at least it will provide us our self-service portal. Again, Service Manager, the installation is quite straightforward, much like OM. You need to think about the accounts and plan your databases, but you need to get through the installation fairly easily. There's a second server involved, which we call the Data Warehouse Management Server, if you want to do reporting. So you get 2 VMs or 2 hosts that you need to put Service Manager on. Now, if we get the basic installation in place, the first thing we need to do is create our connectors, configure our connectors. And like you see in the screenshot here, there are a lot of connectors that we could create. Of course, AD would help to get our users and computers in. If you have Ops Manager like we had already, we can create 2 connectors, either for alerts, for working with them as incidents, or a CI connector that will actually pull in all the data we just saw, all the VM, all the storage, all the other items as CIs for our CMDB. And we can have the other connectors as well for Orchestrator, VMM, etc. We'll look at that in a few minutes. Now, the one thing you might want to consider putting in place as well is what we call the Cloud Services Process Pack, which was released out of band, I'm not sure, I think between 30 and 60 days after System Center 2012. It's a separate management pack that has predefined runbooks, that has predefined templates for our portal that we'll be using in this example. So this is something you want to install as well. And of course, we don't have Orchestrator installed yet, so we'll only do the process pack and not the runbooks. Now, from there on, you might want to import management packs, things like the VMM management pack again. But if you created your own management packs in OM, you actually need to copy them from OM to Service Manager. So all this data will flow from OM to Service Manager as well. Okay, so let's have a look. I'll open up the Service Manager console. Now, I didn't install reporting, so in my workspaces you won't see a reporting tab. But we've installed it. I'm logged on as administrator, so I can see all the other workspaces. And if we look at the connectors workspace, you'll actually see that I've configured all 4 connectors. So it has a connection with AD, with OpsMan, with Orchestrator, and the other items. Now, if I look at configuration items, there are a few things that you might notice. One is being cloud services. That's something you get from that cloud services process pack. This is a node you get from that pack. Other items like computers, those are default views. And if you configure the connectors, all these items, computer CIs, if you will flow into our database. And we can have a look at the characteristics of a certain CI. And if we look at cloud services, and we look, for instance, at services, you'll actually see that that same stock trader we just had was synced from VMM to OM to Service Manager. And from here on, we can actually add extra information to that service, because from OM, we're looking at technical information, but from Service Manager, we want to look at the service level agreement, who are our users, who is the Service Manager, etc. And we'll have a look at that in a second. We can have a look at things like logical networks, capacity pools. All these items we have within OM will be synced to Service Manager. Now, the application we deployed on our cloud is actually called a distributed application in OM, and it's called a business service in Service Manager. And if I double click, you can see that we can actually set things like who's the service owner, is it already in production, etc. If we look at the service components tab, you'll actually see that the items we got from VMM, so the tiers, the different VMs we had provisioned, will actually flow into Service Manager, so we don't need to redefine how our service looks and which computers are involved. And like we said, from there on, we can actually extend these forms and add our own forms for the company where we want to register things like emergency procedure, etc., etc. Now, from here, we can actually have a look at the next step, which will be installing Orchestrator. And again, Orchestrator being new to the family for System Center, it used to be called Opalis, but now with 2012 it's called Orchestrator. And Orchestrator will be used in our example as runbooks for provisioning our VMs and our private cloud. Now again, the installation here is quite straightforward. We need a web server because we want to have the web service installed, because the web service is something that the other System Center products use to connect into Orchestrator. But like you saw in the keynote, the Orchestrator web frontend also helps us to start, stop runbooks and look at the status. Of course, we need a runbook designer and a runbook service checkmark as well, so we get all the components. Now from there on, within Orchestrator, pretty much the only step we need to do is install integration packs. There are integration packs for VMM, for OpsMan, for other products like HP, IBM, but we need to configure them. These integration packs we can download from either a vendor or from the Microsoft site, but normally they'll have a configure setting so that we can specify username, password, connection to the server, etc. And that's pretty much the only thing we need to do for System Center as well, so that Orchestrator can connect back into these other products. Now, if you look at my demo setup, we'll switch to the Orchestrator console, and you'll see on the right-hand side that we have folders that actually contain what we call activities. So any of these folders are what we call an integration pack. There's some examples here. And all these separate items within an integration pack is what we call activities. And if you look, for instance, in Virtual Machine Manager 2012, and I'll try and resize it a bit, you'll see that we'll have different activities like create VM, create VHD, create network adapter, etc., etc. So these are automated tasks. We don't need to think on what's the PowerShell commandlet, how should we do this. We can just drag and drop activities on what we call a runbook. If we go to test, I'll show you quickly how easy that is. Oh, I don't need a folder. I wanted a runbook. And we'll rename it, and we'll call it Teget North America Provision My VM. And we can do two things. We could, for instance, say we'll check every 1 minute. Hello. There we go. 1 minute. And we'll say every 1 minute. And next up would be, for instance, in Service Manager, a certain service request, or in VMM, a certain activity that we want to do. So we could say, well, where do we have it? Get activity. We could just drag and drop items, and in this way make a runbook that does certain things. Now, again, these runbooks are already provided by the Cloud Services Process Pack. So if I look at Cloud Services here, you see that it starts with initialized data. What it actually means is that the Service Manager will call upon Orchestrator to start this runbook and will pass data from that request onto this runbook. But we could also create our own service requests, for instance, for provisioning mailboxes or provisioning other scenarios, runbooks that we can make. Now, if we look at options, you'll actually see that for any integration pack, we can set the configuration. So for instance, for Virtual Machine Manager, could say add, we'll call it VMM. Okay. And we can specify the VMM server, user domain, and all these activities that we use will use that account to connect back into that situation. Now that helps because we now have the basic plumbing in place, and from there, from this way, we can actually go into the portal and start creating requests. Okay, the last item, which is, I guess, more or less an optional item, but if you want to have a proper backup and restore procedure, you might want to consider Data Protection Manager, because Data Protection Manager is the component from System Center that allows you to do backups and restore them. Now, Data Protection Manager, again, very straightforward. If you don't specify SQL installation, it will even install a SQL Express version for you. But once we get it installed, we need to configure storage. because it's a disk-to-disk backup situation or disk-to-disk to tape backup situation, but we need to have some storage on the DPM server to allow backupping. Same thing here, we need to deploy agents to our Hyper-V host so we can make backups. The nice thing of DPM 2010 and 2012 is that once we have an agent on our Hyper-V host, we can also do in-guest backups, and we can also do in-guest restores. So you don't need, per se, an agent in your VM. The only time you would need that is if you want to do coordinated VSS backup. So if you have Exchange or something running in the VM that you want to orchestrate from the volume shadow copy as well, you might want to put an agent in the VM. Next step is creating what we call protection groups. A protection group is where we configure a certain amount of data to be backupped in a certain schedule with a certain time in period. And you create these protection groups, for instance, for your whole host group or certain applications. And because we have already Operations Manager installed, we could use a new feature from DPM 2012, which is called the Central Console. And the Central Console is an installation where you get all these items in Ops Manager to see, are my backups running, and if they fail, I can restart them or do a restore or manage my DPM and my backups from the OM console. Now, one of the things that's new that I quickly want to show you is what we call end-user recovery. And here in my situation, I have DPM installed. The agents, as you can see, are communicating. I've got one virtual disk, 2 terabyte installed, and I got a virtual tape library that I can back up to. And if I look at protection, and scroll a bit, you actually see that I created one protection group for my stock trader application that's backupping the SQL databases, all the databases that are running on my computer. And then if I click here, you actually see that I can configure self-service recovery, and I can specify the AD user group that we want to allow that can do end-user recovery. Now, if I TS into that stock SQL machine, and let's say for the time being, quickly enter the password, that I'm a DBA and that I want to install this, then I install a real tiny application called DPM Self-Service Recovery Tool. I double click it, and that's the only thing I need for me to be able to restore my DB on my application on my private cloud. I say connect to DPM. I'll say new recovery job. I want to get my stock trader DB. I'll say stock trader DB on this SQL instance. Next. It'll ask me for date and time from which I want to restore. I want to go with the 6 a.m. backup. You can recover it to an original instance or to a network folder. Next. I'll quickly browse through it to show you the end result. Destination C restore. Hit next. Security of the recovery point version, recover. And it will actually start restoring. Oh. That's not going too well. Oh, I think the keynote demo gods are with us now. What we should have seen is that actually the MDF and the LDF would be restored, and a DBA, of course, can pick it up from there. Okay. Next phase, pulling in the final integration pieces so we can really call upon these runbooks and start providing this private cloud. In Service Manager, we didn't create the VMM connector yet, so in your situation, you would need to create the VMM connector. Next step, create an Ops Manager connection. Again, you have 2 connectors in Service Manager, one for the CIs, one for the alerts. I meant to say here CI connector, and you actually see which of the management packs that will sync into Service Manager from OM. Of course, the orchestrator connector, like I said, Service Manager will be calling into the web service from orchestrator, so you need to specify that one. Any VMM resources, like we said, we need to pull in. Create some user roles. Who's the admin of this cloud? who's going to be able to request certain things. So role-based security, any notification channels, if you want to send out email like this is provisioned, or you requested this, or this is the status of our request, so we need some notification channels. General properties, these are properties that you see in the Cloud Services Process Pack on certain project IDs, who's the administrator, who's the project owner. You might want to put in there cost properties if you want to use things like Excel, Power Pivot, or the built-in reporting to report on costs for the VMs and all the resources that we provision on the cloud. And we can even work with cost centers, so from the drill down we can associate costs to a certain cost center. And again, these last three pieces are pieces that you get from the Cloud Services Process Pack. If you don't install that one, you won't see those screens, and you might be asking yourself, where is this? So quickly have a look at the process pack. And like we said, it's in the Service Manager space. If you go to Administration, you'll see Cloud Services. And I guess from the right-hand side, you could already see the steps that we need to do. Like I said, create connectors, create user roles, etc. And from here on, we can, for instance, create a cost center. And I already prepared all of these items. So I have a fake cost center and a fake department that we'll be requesting from. Now, if you go to Service Manager, then the next phase would be to create these automated runbooks. Like we said, the Cloud Services Process Pack already delivers on them, so we just need to run the installer for the Cloud Services Process Pack, hit the second button, and it will actually deploy the runbooks into Orchestrator so that we have them ready. So the final piece of the puzzle is creating the service requests. And the service request is the terminology within Service Manager for having a form in our web portal where users can go to. We will ask them questions, and based on that response, we will provision a certain scenario. So we'll publish what we call request offerings. Now, in that Cloud Services Process Pack, Microsoft already prefabricated some of these templates, so I can just take them as is, or ask other questions like certain things that might make sense for your organization, on in which location are you, other things you might want to register or use from within the runbook. But let's say we take them as is, then the request offering is the template, the form itself. We have what we call a service offering, which is more or less the grouping of a certain number of requests and an icon and something that we'll see in the portal. And last but not least is create groups so that people can actually access certain requests, yes or no. Okay, now we've gone ahead of time creating those. So I'll start up. And this is actually the Service Manager self-service portal. Now, as you can see, it's based on SharePoint. If I click here, you actually clearly see it's SharePoint based. But what you could also see from skinning this template is that I'm able to change it to my needs. So if I want to change colors or logos or other items, it's just SharePoint. So with your SharePoint knowledge, you could do that, of course. And this is a web part, and this web part can actually be added to an existing SharePoint installation as well. So you have this within your corporate internet. Now I'll click on Private Cloud, which is a service offering, and within that service offering, I have specific service requests. I can create a capacity pool, I can create a project, or I could just, for instance, request a virtual machine. Now the one thing that's interesting is service request. Let's say I want to have a demo environment of my stock trader to do some development on or testing. I can go to this request form, and I'll say demo environment of stock trader. Urgency we'll call medium. A certain capacity pool we want to put it in. Refresh. I think it's based on the resolution. Stock. I think the keynote demo gods are still with us. What we actually should have seen here is stock trader. We'll select stock trader, hit next, another 4 questions, and we could actually from there on have a service request. Now let's go back and then request a VM instead. so I can at least show you how the provisioning works. I'll say a virtual machine, enter the service request title, tag it NA, on this production pool, name, tag it NA test 01, scroll down a bit, next, template, Windows Server 2008, it's the VM template, production network, a decommissioning date, if you will, could use that in a runbook as well, it's tomorrow, and we'll have Contoso administrator be the first to have rights to that VM, and from there on we can say submit, and it will actually log what we call a service request in Service Manager, and the user itself can also follow it from this portal online. And if I have a look in Service Manager, and we'll go to work items, you actually see a green section called Service Request Fulfillment, and we'll say all open service requests, and we here see our tagged service request. Now there's a whole template behind it which you could modify for all the steps you want to do based on this request. We might want to ask for approval, update financial statements, maybe want to provision it already or do some other 5 steps in between. But all these activities is something we can sequence from Service Manager. So here you see all these steps in this example sequentially that will run through before it's provisioned. But we could fairly easily add an activity, for instance, say a review activity, and ask a certain IT manager or a certain head of a department to approve this before we go ahead and use it. Now from here on, you'll see actually, based on the acronyms RA, runbook activity, that this is the one that will be asked from or called upon from Service Manager to do the work. Now, within the Cloud Services Process Pack, Microsoft also delivered an example report, for instance, for reporting. Now, again, this works in Excel, and it works with Power Pivot, but the slicers, the dicers, all the tables have already been pre-formatted. So based on the cost information, based on the database with Service Manager, you can reconnect this sheet back into your environment and use this as a starting point to do some reporting on the usage within your environment, which you could call show back or chart back in a certain situation. Now then the final phase is that we saw that within the self-service portal, within Service Manager, we could already allow a user to fill in a form to do a certain request. But once the VM is provisioned or the service is provisioned, you might want to provide them with access for them to start the service, stop the service, scale it out based on, of course, the rights you've given them. But that's the last phase where we'll actually use App Controller to provide access to end users. So the first thing we do, again, here is install App Controller. Not much is needed, just a web server, and from that web server, you'll actually have the App Control service. Once App Controller is installed, of course, we need to configure the VMM connection so that we actually have an understanding. And once we start configuring and managing public clouds, we can also add connection to Azure, and like you saw in the keynote, even to remotely hosted VMM situations. And of course, from here on, create some roles or lean on the VMM roles based on what you want to provide them. There we go. Now let's have a look. We actually need this. Here we have App Controller. I'll log in as administrator, so I have a clear sight of all the clouds and services. And you see that I'm connected to VMM, but also to my Azure subscription. So once I have a look at clouds, you'll see my tagged cloud, my private cloud, and my Azure cloud. And have a look at services. You'll actually see the same stock trader. I'll hit open diagram. And from here on, somebody can also stop, start, suspend, etc. So based on the rights I have, I might provide them with the app controller console so they can actually manage their own services on this private cloud. Okay, so those are the 10 steps I think we need to undertake to create a private cloud with Windows Server, Hyper-V, and a System Center. So what we got is basic management of our resources. The hypervisors want to manage not only Hyper-V, but also the other vendors. On that, we can create our clouds, an abstract definition of the items we want to provide resources to. We can create definitions of our application and deploy it to our clouds. From there on, we can use App Controller to provide them to end users and to have them manage them. Ops Manager for really monitoring our fabric all the way up to our application, not only what VMM allows us to see, but also from there on extended using, for instance, Visio. We could use Service Manager for providing the process side of things. Once we get a request, that we can provision it, and we'll use Orchestrator, of course, to provision things and to have the runbooks to work with all these items. The self-service portal within Service Manager to do the requests in, and then integrated is the CMDB, because everything we provision and with the connectors in place will actually have all the CIs within our CMDB fully automated. And again, Service Manager as the central console, for instance, for sending out service request status updates and allowing your users to have a clear view of where their request is. Excel and Office for reporting. And I want to close off with a video of a case we did in the Netherlands with KLM that actually we deployed a private cloud in based on System Center 2012 for their Linux VMware environment.
Microsoft Services and KLM approached us to help them implement the System Center 2012 stack. They want to use the technologies we are very familiar with, so we can align them to achieve the processes they're now performing manually. Private cloud within KLM has a self-service portal, which is the same for all users and all types of requests. For the KLM project, we used Orchestrator and Service Manager, where in Service Manager we embedded the process of approval. Financial approval is embedded in Service Manager, and we created service requests that were published in the SharePoint portal, so end user can perform their own request fulfillment.
Currently at KLM we have a server delivery process that takes roughly 6 weeks. And KLM was looking for a way to shorten this 6 weeks delivery time to basically say 0 days. This of course was a big challenge because we have a fairly complex infrastructure, and our infrastructure has on the one hand has Linux servers based on Red Hat with VMware virtualization, and on the other hand we have the Windows 2008 environment with Hyper-V virtualization.
In the pilot we have used the System Center 2012 beta bits to manage both the VMware environment and the Microsoft Hyper-V environment. Because we were using beta bits from Microsoft, we had to combine our strengths with a partner, Innovative and Microsoft Consulting Services, to cope with all the challenges that are there. But in the end we were very successful, and we delivered a fully automated self-service process for virtual machines, both on Linux and Microsoft Windows.
One of the powerful things of the self-service portal is the end-user experience for both Linux and Microsoft virtual machines is exactly the same. So for the end user there's no difference between a service request for one of both.
As a solution, we found that Microsoft System Center 2012 was offering us a lot of capabilities for automating the whole process of server delivery. In the end, a service portal was delivered where we can request the basic 2 types of servers, and in the end they were fully automated provisioned on the 2 different virtualization platforms that we currently have. In this way we were able to shorten the whole process from 6 weeks to 0 days. And not only we have shortened the lead time in delivering service, but also a lot of repetitive tasks that are currently done by skilled engineers don't have to be performed anymore, and those people can do other tasks.
By using the self-service provisioning for both the Linux and the Microsoft virtual machines, our data center is way more efficient because we have just-in-time delivery. We don't have to install servers days before we use it. We can actually do it the morning before we start using it. So we save a lot of capacity, and we save a lot of energy and money deploying it just in time.
Cool. So just an example of a big airline that's actually betting their business now on System Center and Windows Server Hyper-V, and actually has pulled in their Linux VMware environment to do the same private cloud characteristics on as well. Now, just to summarize, because we're already over time, is cloud is not something that replaces things, but to us it's a journey where you can pool the resources and build all these attributes using System Center. To us it's a hybrid world, so it's no matter whether it's private or public, we want to manage it from System Center, and it's ready now. You can use System Center 2012, of course, today. I'll be at the experts booth at System Center booth on the Technical Learning Center if you have any questions, but I'll also be able to do some questions here next to the podium. And I guess, well, thank you for attending. Have a look at my ticket, fill in the eval forms so we can learn from you and things we can improve in the sessions, and thank you for attending.